Hello and welcome to this lecture on the politics of America in the Industrial Age, 1865 to 1900. In this lecture, we are going to overview the political situation in the United States entering 1900. Now, what you're going to see is between 1900 and 1945 is a shift in American politics and a greater delineation between the political parties that existed in the prior age. But the big shift in American politics really won't occur until the 1960s. But it's important that we have these conversations now to frame the conversations that we'll have later. So then as now, we were largely a two-party system. There were other political parties. We'll actually address one of them at the end of this lecture. But by and large, we were a two-party system from 1865 forward. And the parties are the same parties that we have today. We have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. One of the things you have to get used to is that today, the Democratic and Republican parties are ideologically and geographically distinct. And what I mean by that is that each party has a clear ideology that it subscribes to. Yes, within the party there are ideological differences over how to achieve that ideological vision, but by and large there is pretty strong ideological uniformity on each side of the party, at least in words and rhetoric. Also, within the two parties today, there are clear geographic realities. And what I mean by that is that if you look at a map, you can geographically identify the areas that lean Republican, and you can geographically identify the areas that lean Democrat. And then within each state, you can picture geographically what are the Democratic and what are the Republican parts of each state. And there are really only a handful of states, and within each state, only a handful of regions that are what political observers and scholars call swing districts or swing states, meaning they can go back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. Mostly in the country today, there is ideological uniformity along geography. And so, based on ideology and based on geography, you can with relative certainty predict what state and which regions of the state are going to trend towards what political party. You could not do that prior to the 20th century. So prior to the 20th century, you could not clearly distinguish in terms of ideology or geography where the political parties would be strong, where they would be weak, with the exception of the American South. What that means is that in the late 19th century, you had a much more ideological and geographically fluid situation, meaning that the two political parties tended to be parties that contained a lot of diversity within them in terms of their political ideologies and in terms of their geography. And that's what we want to explore by looking at each party and figuring out the diversity within each party. So let's start with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was strong in the South. This is the most geographically predictable political affiliation area of the country in the late 19th century. The Democratic Party is strong in the South. It is the party of segregation and white supremacy in the South. The Southern Democrats are the party of segregation. They are the party of Jim Crow. They are the white supremacist party. You have to understand that. That's a key constituency of the Democratic Party prior to 1965 are Southern Democrats. And Southern Democrats are white and they are segregationists. However, the Democratic Party also has significant support in both the North and the West. So in the North, you have a lot of Democrats, particularly among the immigrants. Catholic immigrants tend to support the Democratic Party. And so you have within the North a strong tradition among certain immigrant groups, especially Catholic immigrant groups like the Irish and the Italians. That said, you also have pockets of pro-business Northern Democrats. They were often pejoratively called the bourbon Democrats because they were sort of like drinking bourbon in back rooms, making deals with business leaders. But they are a part of the Democratic constituency as well. The Democrats also have some strength out west, especially among farmers. There is some strength among farmers out west in the Democratic Party. So geographically, the Democratic Party is the strongest in the South, but they have significant support in the North among some pro-business Democrats, but especially immigrants. Immigrants from Europe tended to join the Democratic Party, particularly Catholic immigrants. And in the West, there is significant support for the Democrats among farmers. So you have another major area of the Democratic Party is the Democrats are starting to attract the support of workers and the working poor. The union movement that we talked about in previous lectures is beginning to find a more receptive audience among Democratic politicians. And so unions tend to be, the union members tend to support the Democratic Party. Not universal, but they're trending towards supporting the Democratic Party. That means there is a little bit of a tension in the Democratic Party between some northern pro-business Democrats and Democrats in the West among the farmers, and in the South and among the immigrants and the union members in the North who are looking to push a more reform-minded agenda. They want to attack the privileges of business, target the power of the trusts and the monopolies, and are looking to pursue a little bit more of a reform agenda. And so you have this interesting coalition that's emerging between white supremacists who, on the one hand, are incredibly racist and supporting white supremacy in the South, but are also starting to be antitrust and anti-corporate. In the West, you have those antitrust, anti-corporate sentiments among the farmers. In the North, they are attracting the support of immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants, and of organized labor and unions and the workers and working poor. I'd also like to mention that one of the tensions that's emerging in the Democratic Party, in addition to the tensions over business and white supremacy, Southern Democrats tend to be anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Catholic immigrant. And so what you're starting to see is that Southern Democrats are increasingly uncomfortable with the immigrants that are being attracted to their party in the North. Democrats are finding strength in rapidly growing urban areas, but they're also finding a base among farmers who feel exploited and aggrieved by the power of the trusts and the monopolies, particularly the railroad trusts. So there is this major tension within the Democratic Party between more conservatives and more progressives. It's another tension we need to be aware of. Now, this tension is between conservative and progressives in Democratic Party is a bit different than you might be expecting. Conservative Democrats tend to be pro-business. Progressive Democrats tend to want greater regulation of business. They tend to want the monopolies and the trusts broken up, and they tend to be in favor of workers' unions and workers' rights. And that's a tension that is in the Democratic Party due to this unique coalition they've created. Now let's talk about the Republican Party during the same time period. The Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, is a pretty diverse political coalition in terms of its regional appeal and ideological appeal. The theme here for both parties is there is not ideological uniformity. There is not ideological uniformity. What you're seeing here is a wide array of perspectives and geographic appeal under the banner of the party. So, with the Republican Party, we get geographically, they're very strong in the North. Very strong in the North. They also have significant support in the West. The Republican Party has a strong WASP identity. As we'll talk about in just a moment, this strong WASP identity is going to create a tension within the party over immigration. The Republican Party is strong with the white middle class, meaning middle class professionals like your lawyers and doctors and people with college degrees. They're also strong with the industrialists and the captains of industry. The Republican Party tends to favor laissez-faire capitalism. They tend to favor laissez-faire capitalism, and so they tend to be very popular with the industrialists, the captains of industry, the Gilded Age group. However, they also have significant African American support. This is a legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Because of the Civil War and Reconstruction, African Americans tended to be loyal to the Republican Party. Now, in the South, that didn't really matter that much because the way in which Jim Crow laws had disenfranchised African American communities. African American communities had been so discriminated against through violence and state constitutional change in the law that African American support for the Republican Party in the South didn't have much political implication. That said, African Americans in the North, and African Americans do migrate north in the late 19th century as part of searching for industrial jobs and to escape Jim Crow segregation in the South. African Americans who do move north tend to support, and then African Americans who had lived in the North for generations tend to support the Republican Party. This creates interesting tensions within the Republican Party over race and racial identity. On the one hand, the leadership and the majority of the membership of the Republican Party tend to identify as WASP. They do have significant African American support, and African Americans expect the Republican Party to be the party that protects their civil rights. And it will be true that at various points in the late 19th century, Northern Republicans will bring up, they will raise in Congress, they will raise in the press, they will raise in the courts the Jim Crow segregation and the white supremacy that has been ingrained and established in the South after Reconstruction. But they will make no serious efforts to overturn it. And in many ways, the Republican attack on the system was politically motivated. They know that if black people in the South could vote, they would vote Republican, and therefore there would be political value in pushing this issue and pushing, African Americans to be given their rights. But they never pushed too hard. And by and large, I would argue the reason they never pushed too hard is their strong WASP identity. They accepted African American support, but they weren't necessarily vested in trying to overturn this system. They were just taking advantage of whatever support the African Americans could give them and what political benefits they could reap from that. There's also significant tension over immigration related to the WASP identity of the Republican Party. The industrialists tended to look down on immigrants. They tended to speak horribly of immigrants. They might even be anti-immigrant in the way they viewed things. But the industrialists were pro-immigration for their work. Their industries relied heavily on waves of immigrants providing low-paid wage labor in dangerous conditions. This was also part of the Republican strategy to be anti-union. The Republican Party was anti-union. As such, the Republican Party had a vested interest in using immigrants to break unions. And how they would do that is that, of course, if a strike occurred at a particular factory or across many industries, they would just use immigrant labor to replace the workers as part of their strategy. And we talked about that in a previous lecture, so I'm just kind of reminding you of that. So the industrialists might have been anti-immigrant in their prejudices and in their cultural prejudices, but they were pro-immigration for their business practice. By contrast, the those with a strong WASP identity and those in the middle class tended to be anti-immigrant, and they tended to support immigration restrictions. And their immigration restrictions went with their strong moralist sentiment. And what I mean by that is they looked at immigrants as dirty, beneath them, and amoral. This is all part of their prejudice and discrimination against immigrants. And as a consequence, they tended to moralize the issue of immigration. They tended to attribute superior morals to those with a WASP identity and inferior morals to those who were immigrants coming from areas of Europe, like, say, Jewish immigrants, Catholic immigrants, immigrants from Asia. And so there is this moralizing associated with the Republican Party that is related to their cultural and values. So what we have here are two parties that are what political scientists call big tents. And what they mean by big tent is each party has significant diversity, both ideological and geographic, in their party. The Republican Party has geographic and ideological diversity. The Democratic Party has geographic and ideological diversity. What that means is that in order to hold the party together, they have to come up with platforms that represent compromises, that represent a little bit of what each side wants. Now, oftentimes these compromises are successful, and it means that the party can successfully keep their voter base together enough to win elections, win seats at the federal, state, and local level, and pursue their policy agenda. Many times, though, they can't hold their ideological coalition together, and that gives one party an advantage over another. What we're talking about is a much more fluid political situation than you might see necessarily today. One of the hallmarks of this time period that we are talking about is what historians call machine politics. So, machine politics. Now, machine politics is this term for the system in which there are individuals called bosses who can deliver votes. And these votes were like a machine. It was like you fed the machine and you got the outcome that you wanted. That's kind of the analogy that's being made here. This is something you find mostly in America's growing cities, although it could happen in rural areas. But it was mostly a feature of American cities. So what are you talking about with machine politics? Well, let's just briefly understand something about democracy, right? How do democracies work? Well, in general, the candidate that gets the most votes wins an election. Now, we know in the case of the presidency, that's not always true because the electoral college means you could lose the popular vote but still win the electoral college, which has happened several times in our nation's history. But overall, for most elected offices, right, what happens is that you have the person who gets the most votes wins the election. And therefore, elections are about making sure your voters turn out so that your voters carry the day at the ballot. So understanding that, right, we can now understand what machine politics are. What machine politics are the ability to make sure your voters turn out. So what you had happen in cities in particular, because once again, this is about cities. In cities, you had people who lived in various neighborhoods. You had working class neighborhoods, middle class neighborhoods, areas where the wealthy lived. You had immigrant neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods were little communities unto themselves. And within these neighborhoods emerged individuals called bosses. And they're called political bosses. And these are people who were powerful in certain neighborhoods. Sometimes they were immigrant neighborhoods. Sometimes they were class neighborhoods, like working class neighborhoods or factory neighborhoods or something along that. Whatever the case is, these people were bosses. They were local leaders. They weren't necessarily elected officials. In many cases, they weren't elected officials. These were local power brokers. They were local leaders within these communities, oftentimes unelected, oftentimes just someone locally that was trusted or who had a lot of informal powerhood in a neighborhood. These were the bosses. These bosses had such influence over their neighborhoods that they could influence the way their neighborhoods voted. They could turn out the vote. One word from them, and people would turn out to vote for the candidate that they told them to. All it took was one word. And so getting these bosses to support you, whether you're running for city council or mayor, or for state government like governor or another state office, or for a federal position like a member of, a representative in Congress, or even the running for the presidency. Getting these bosses' support was considered critically important because of the votes that they could deliver. And so what would happen in this political age very often, especially in cities, is political campaigns focused on those bosses. What could you do to convince that boss to support you? Because if you convince that boss to support you, you carried that neighborhood with the majority of votes and sometimes the overwhelming majority of votes. So these political bosses were incredibly powerful power brokers. They could bring politicians the votes that they needed, or they could deny them the votes that they needed. And you had even presidents going into cities like Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Boston and going to the local political bosses and saying, what do you need to deliver votes to me? And these people had incredible influence, incredible power within their community. They could translate that into political power as they saw fit. So what you end up happening in the late 19th and early 20th century is business leaders and politicians vying for the support of these bosses so these bosses can deliver votes. Now, as you might well imagine, this system is prone to corruption. These political bosses often got bribes and political positions, corporate positions, and all other manners of incentives to sway the votes for a particular party or a particular candidate. So this system was prone to all sorts of corruption. And you can read books on the corruption. You can see political cartoons like the one I have here that are demonstrating the corruption that this system is prone to delivering. That said, there are people, even to this day, that are supporters of this system. And they say that this system might seem corrupt on the surface, but it was a way to mobilize voters and force politicians and political parties to be responsive to the needs of individual communities in their districts, in their state, or in the country as a whole. In other words, what its supporters say is, look, these bosses might have been corrupt, because many of them were, but they also knew that they could only move the voters in their district if they were seen as delivering for those voters. That loyalty was a two-way street. You were loyal to the boss, but the boss had to be loyal to you. And in doing so, they could gain real political reforms and political wins for their communities. They could get things for their communities, and they had to get things for their communities in order to continue to be a boss and enjoy the benefits of being a political boss. I'm not here to deliver moral judgment on this system. What's clear is that there was a lot of corruption in the system. The evidence is plain and unambiguous. That said, what is also very, very clear is that these political bosses did get significant pieces of legislation or significant reforms or significant bills proposed and passed at the local, state, and federal level that their communities wanted. And could they have gotten those pieces of legislation, those policies, etc., without the machine system? I don't know in the late 19th, early 20th century. I simply don't know. But regardless, this is a big feature of politics in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And to be clear here, this is not exclusive to one party or another. Although each party might have their own machine, many of these political bosses in these communities were what you might think of as independent operators. They were willing to go with whoever offered them the best deal, right? And therefore, both parties had to compete for them. Now, let's spend the last little bit of this lecture talking about one of the major movements of the late 19th century, the populist movement. The populist movement is a political reform movement that will have profound influence on the course of American politics in the 20th century. The movement itself is not particularly successful or effective in the late 19th century, but the ideas that the movement inspired will profoundly reshape the United States in the decades to come. So we need to understand it so we can see the origins of so many of these ideas. So the populist movement is a political movement born in the late 19th century out of the changes that industrialization brought on society. Industrialization simply disrupted American life in profound ways that we've explored throughout this particular unit. And these changes brought about new political movements and groups that were seeking reform. This reform actually begins in rural America with a group like the Grangers. So in rural America, you have Grange halls all over rural America, especially in the West. Almost every rural community has a Grange hall. Well, the Grange hall, most people don't know where the name comes from, but they were the Grangers. And the Grangers were a farm movement and a political movement of farmers seeking reforms on a whole host of issues that we'll talk about in just a moment. There was another movement called the Farmers Alliance. Rural America really felt the pinch of industrialization in some pretty unique ways. One, they saw the population simply evaporate. In most places in rural America, the population evaporates. We talked about earlier in this unit, right? People left the countryside to go find work in the cities because of the ways in which industrialization changed the economy. But many farmers remained, particularly out west. Farmers were still out west, and there were still farmers back east, although many farmers, farming as an economic activity tended to move west during the 19th century, and farming became less part of the economy in northern eastern states, not in the South, but in northern eastern states, farming became less of the economy. In the South, farming is still strong. But as people left rural areas to go into the cities, it changed the nature of business for farmers. Farmers were used to selling their farm produce locally. Well, now there is no local population to sell their farm produce to. They're dependent on shipping it to the cities. Well, how are they going to ship it to the cities? They're going to ship it on the railroads, which means that the farmers were some of the first people to feel the railroad monopolies, the high prices, because there was no competition. They were also groups that were feeling the pinch of monopolies in other industries because they were dependent on buying goods from factories because local tailors, local blacksmiths, all sorts of local craftsmen had gone out of business. So farmers, from both a business and a consumer perspective, were really feeling the pinch of the monopolies before many other groups in the United States. But pretty soon, right, you also get groups like unions and organized labor and groups in cities who are seeing the changes industrialization is bringing, from pollution to infrastructure challenges to public health challenges to corruption. There's all sorts of problems emerging. And so a reform movement is starting to emerge. And eventually these forces of reform coalesced into what's called the Populist Party or the People's Party, which was created in 1892. It goes by both names, the Populist Party or the People's Party. And this was an independent movement that didn't think that either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party fully represented its views, so it put forth its own views. And this populist party or People's Party put forward ideas that were not adopted in its own time period, not adopted in the 1890s, but will be tremendously important in the early 20th century. So what was it that these reform movements wanted that eventually coalesced into the Populist Party? Well, this was their program. One, they wanted the direct election of U.S. senators. Remember, at this time, U.S. senators are appointed by the state legislature. This has led to a system in which there's a lot of corruption in both political parties through the state legislature in who gets to be appointed a U.S. senator. The populists felt that if you directly elected your U.S. senators, 2 per state, that you could have a greater impact on reform, that the Senate would be an active participant in reform. We're not going to talk a lot about this, but reform movements could gain traction in the House of Representatives because individual House districts often fell in reform districts, and as a consequence, reformers often got sent to the House. The Populist Party or the People's Party sent lots of members to the House, but the Senate could get, but reformers, be they within the existing 2 political parties or be they populists, they could get no traction in the Senate because, of course, the Senate was not directly elected, and senators were responsive to their state parties and their state legislatures, not to the people of their states. Populists wanted government assistance to farmers. They wanted government assistance to farmers. They wanted programs specifically to help farmers. They're asking for social services. They're asking for a government to do social services. Now, this is a direct attack or critique on free market capitalism, on laissez-faire capitalism, because they are saying that government should play a role in assisting farmers in a way that means the market is not totally free and left alone. They want some form of intervention. One of the biggest interventions they want are federal loans for farmers. They want federal loans for farmers. This is born out of the fact that between in 1873 and again in 1893, there were economic depressions in the United States, and rural communities felt these depressions acutely. And so farmers believed that federal loan programs could help them during lean times and during periods of recovery. They also wanted government ownership of railroads, telephones, and telegraphs. They saw these as essential utilities and services that should not be subject to monopolies and price gouging. They thought that since everyone needed to use the railroads, government should own those railroads and charge a fair price. Since everyone needed communication, like telephones and telegraphs, those services should be available for fair prices. This is asking for government regulation, asking for government intervention in the economy. It directly contradicts the laissez-faire capitalist ideas that were so dominant among the business elites. They wanted to break the national banks to be broken up. They thought that there was too much financial concentration in the banks. So they wanted the banks broken up. They wanted banks broken up and small banks created. There was even some groups that wanted government banks so that government would charge fair interest rates. They wanted government banks, as I just said, and they wanted government to control the currency. At this point, the United States currency is on what's called on the gold standard. Which means that the paper currency is tied to the amount of gold bullion that the United States has, and the value of the paper currency is just floating. Well, what populists wanted was government to step in and control the value of the currency. There was also a movement within the reformers called free silver, which basically they wanted silver coinage to supplement the gold coin. And all this was really about creating a currency value that was more heavily regulated by the government and more favorable to farmers and to consumers as opposed to big business interests. They also wanted an income tax. They wanted the government to pay for its programs through an income tax. Now, an income tax is not a simple piece of legislation. Like the direct election of senators, it would require a constitutional amendment, but they wanted it. Now, this movement never becomes a majority in the United States, but becomes a significant movement. So much so that, as I just mentioned a little bit ago, they formed their own political party and they got people elected to state government and into the United States House of Representatives. But perhaps the biggest impact of the populist movement is that even though the populist political party as a whole didn't gain the kind of national support that they wanted, they gained significant support in the West and in the South to impact the Democratic Party. The populist movement will find its ideas folded into the Democratic Party over the coming decades. The populist movement's biggest impact is the way in which it moved the Democratic Party to embrace a lot of these ideas, since many of the Democratic constituencies were supporters of the populist party. And this is most exemplified in one of the most important and leading politicians of the 1890s and early 1900s, but for whom is largely forgotten by Americans today. And that's this gentleman on the left of your slide here. He is William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan. And he was a Democratic politician who rose to prominence in the 1890s. First, he was elected to the House of Representatives, and later he will become an important presidential candidate. And William Jennings Bryan is a brilliant thinker and one of the most gifted speakers in American history. He was famous for his rhetorical flourishes and his ability to move people with his speeches. And William Jennings Bryan embraced the populist movement. He remained part of the Democratic Party, but he embraced the populist movement and its platform. And he was so popular within the Democratic Party that he was able to make these ideas part of the Democratic agenda in the years and decades to come. Bryan will run for president 3 times. He will never win, but he will run for president 3 times. The first is in 1896, in which he is nominated for the presidency. By the way, that same year, the Populist Party nominated him as well, so he had both parties' endorsements in 1896. He lost that election to William McKinley. He ran again in 1900, losing again. He then ran in 1908 and once again lost. He will later go on to become Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, but will resign because he did not support Wilson's decision to go to war and enter the United States in World War I. But William Jennings Bryan, will be responsible for taking these ideas and making them part of the Democratic Party platform. And beginning in 1912, we will see many of these things incorporated into American political reform. We'll see a lot of these things become part of this platform. Now, the populist movement and the movements that preceded it will get some minor reforms in its own day. You get the Contract Labor Act of 1885. This one forbid businesses and corporations from going over and recruiting workers abroad and then bringing them over and forcing them to work off their debts. So it prevented that. That said, this piece of legislation was largely ineffective because businesses found a way out of that by using local recruiters. So as long as they didn't go abroad and do it, it was okay. They could work through intermediaries in the countries. But nonetheless, it was considered a victory. There was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was really about regulating. Congress, according to Article 1 of the Constitution, has the right to regulate commerce between the states. So constitutionally, this is allowed under the Constitution. What this act did is it was designed to regulate the railroad industry in a way to prevent monopolies. It required railroads rates to be reasonable and just. And so it said basically railroads weren't allowed to gouge. It was supposed to attack the power of the monopolies. The problem is it didn't give government power to do anything about it. So it was symbolic more than anything else. But it was a recognition that this was a problem, something that the farmers and the populist movement had been saying. Probably their biggest piece of legislation was what was called the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This act empowered the federal government to break up trusts. It just said trusts were illegal and unconstitutional, and trusts were allowed to be broken up. The problem is you can have a piece of legislation on the book, but if no one is enforcing it, then it doesn't matter. And this thing just simply was not enforced, although later politicians, later presidents are going to. So there's your look at the politics of the industrial age. This is just an overview. It's just meant as an introduction, but it does give you a sense of the political coalitions and the movements that defined late 19th century politics as industrialization is taking root across the country. I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.